Welcome back to the place for all things mirrorless, and today we're looking at sensor sizes and we'll be asking the question, does anyone actually need a full frame sensor? If you think you might, check this one out. So full frame is a kind of a buzzword just at the moment, and it's a sort of a fashionable sensor size to aspire to. And the marketing leads us to believe that full frame is better and that smaller sensors than full frame are not quite as good as full frame in some way that is never very clearly defined, at least not in the advertising material. So we'll be looking today at what full frame really means for photographers, and indeed what smaller sensor sizes mean for photographers as well, especially because this is xenography, especially if you're shooting with vintage lenses. So why is full frame such a buzzword at the moment? Well, let's have a look at it. There are three commonly available sensor sizes, generally speaking, in mirrorless cameras at the moment, and those are micro four thirds. That's the smallest generally available sensor. That's roughly the size of a piece of 16mm film, or rather a frame of 16mm film. That's one of these. It's quite small film, as you can see. And the actual measurements of that are 17.3 by 13mm. So compared to the sensor in your phone, which is teeny weeny tiny little thing, measuring just single millimeters, even micro four thirds is a pretty big sensor. The next sensor size we commonly find available is APS-C, and that is roughly the size of a frame of 35mm movie film, not still film, but movie film. This is a piece of 35mm movie film. It's also a piece of 35mm still film, and the only difference is the way it runs in the camera. Movie film runs from top to bottom. The film is exactly the same, the perforations are exactly the same, the dimensions are exactly the same. It is identical. The only difference is, in a movie camera, it runs top to bottom, so that gives us a smaller frame than if we're shooting side to side, because that's the way the film runs in still cameras. So APS-C is about the same size as a frame of 35mm movie film, and that's a pretty big size. And don't forget that if you go and see a film at the cinema that's shot on film, like for example many of the Star Wars films are, in fact I think all of Tarantino's films are, you're watching an APS-C sized frame blown up to immense proportions. So you know, if anybody says APS-C doesn't have enough resolution, then I would refer them to the movies, which clearly demonstrate that it does have very, very good resolution. The other sensor size that's commonly available is, of course, full frame. That's the same size as a piece of 35mm still film, not movie film that runs from top to bottom, but still film that runs from side to side. The film is the same. The only thing is, the only difference is it runs horizontally in a still camera. So you get a bigger frame of 24 by 36mm, and those are the commonly available sizes that you'll find at the moment. So all right, so we know what full frame is. It's the same size as a 35mm still negative, which is 24 by 36mm. But how was that size arrived at? How did full frame get its size? What happened? Well, I'll tell you what didn't happen. Nobody sat down in a room with lots of smart people to find the perfect size for a frame of film. Nobody did that. It just didn't happen. It was an arbitrary decision. Totally arbitrary. And here's how it came about. You may have heard of a gentleman called Oscar Barnack. He worked at Leica, and he was the designer of these cameras. This is a Leica 2 from 1932. It's a lovely little rangefinder. I use it quite a lot because it's really small and it's a beautiful little thing, and it still works perfectly well. It does the same today that it did 90 odd years ago when it was made. So this is what Barnack came up with, and this was known in its day as a miniature camera. 35mm still photography was known as miniature photography, because most of the cameras around at that time, certainly in the late 1900s, the early 1920s, most of the cameras around were very large box cameras into which large glass plates were put, and even sometimes you had to paint on the emulsion before you put the plate into the camera. So it was a messy business, it was a time-consuming business, and it was a heavy business. If you wanted to carry this camera around anywhere, you're carrying a very, very large piece of kit with you. So that's relevant. Oscar Barnack loved walking. He was a very keen walker. He loved walking in nature, in the hills and the forests of Germany. Absolutely loved it. He also loved photography, but Mr. Barnack's problem, Herr Barnack's problem, was that he was asthmatic. He had quite a bad case of asthma, so it was very difficult for him to carry and lug around these enormous plate cameras. He wanted something smaller, so he set about designing something smaller. He set about designing a miniature camera. So he also needed to put into that camera some miniature film. He looked around. Who's making small film? Who's using really small film? And he looked at the movies and he saw that they were using this film. This is a strip of either 35mm still film, if you turn it that way, or 35mm movie film, if you turn it that way. It's exactly the same, and it hasn't changed since Barnack was around in the 1920s. So this was the miniature film that he used, and instead of running top to bottom, he turned it so it runs in the camera horizontally across the width of the machine. And that's how we arrived at the frame size of 24 by 36 millimeters, because when you put this into a 35mm camera, you put this into a body this size, that's the frame size it gives. So you can see that it was purely an arbitrary choice. Barnack took movie film, which runs top to bottom, and he just turned it sideways, and he thought, yes, that's the perfect film to use. And you can see why. It was very, very small when you compare it to the glass plates of the time. But the important thing to note here is it wasn't a choice that was arrived at through any sort of deliberation or any sort of technical process. It was an arbitrary choice. So what's better about that size? What's better about 24 by 36mm that we call nowadays full frame? I'll tell you what's better about it. Nothing. Nothing is better about it, at least not inherently. There's nothing inherently superior about this film size and this frame size. But it is the size of frame, it is the frame size that 35mm film cameras like this were designed to work with. So here's how full frame actually differs in practice to smaller sensor cameras. Here's how it actually differs. Number one, full frame sensors collect more light. Now that's a pretty simple observation because they've got more surface area. They're a bigger thing, so more light is falling upon them than falls upon a smaller sensor. So we get cleaner images at higher ISO settings. In low light, when you whack up the ISO on your camera, supposing you're shooting in very dark conditions and you have to put the ISO up to, 20,000 ISO, let's say. All you're doing when you turn the ISO dial is you're increasing the amount of electrical current that goes to the sensor, and so that makes it much more sensitive, but it also results in more noise in your final image. That's what noise is. That's what digital noise is. It's just random electrical activity that's generated somehow or other by the fact that more juice is being sent into the sensor, so it generates this random electrical activity, and it looks flipping awful every time. There is no scenario in which digital noise looks even remotely nice. Film grain is a different thing. Film noise, or what's called grain on film, is a different thing. That can be nicer. That can be quite a nice effect. I don't like it just for its own sake, but it can be a nice effect. Somehow or other, a little bit of grain, a little bit of, you know, those particles of silver dancing around in the background can be quite a nice effect in certain images. Although I don't like it necessarily in and of itself. But digital noise is always flipping horrible. So the point here is that there is less boost needed when you turn up your ISO to 20,000 on a full frame sensor. Because it's collecting more light anyway and it has a bigger surface area, it doesn't need quite as high a boost in electrical current that a smaller sensor will do. To shoot at the same light, 20,000 ISO with a micro four thirds sensor, you'd have to send more electrical current to it. So that makes more noise. So full frame sensors are less noisy in low light, and that is why. All right, the second way in which full frame sensors differ from smaller sensors in actual practice, in day-to-day use, is that if you're shooting a vintage lens, a lens like this little Industar 22 that's sitting on my Leica 2 here, if you're shooting a vintage lens, there's no crop factor. Now, I've talked about the crop factor recently, so I won't go into huge detail again here. However, I will mention what it actually does. This is a 50mm lens. On a full frame camera, it works as a 50mm lens. It gives a 50mm focal length. If I put this on a smaller sensor camera, for example on a micro four thirds camera, it will behave as though it was a 100mm lens. It will give an effective focal length of 100mm. It sounds a bit silly, but it really does happen, I assure you. Test it, try it. It can be difficult to get your head around, but it really is there. It also reduces the minimum focus distance, or the effective minimum focus distance of a lens. So the minimum focus distance of this lens on full frame is 3 feet or 1 meter. Put that on a micro four thirds camera and it goes down to half that, 50 centimeters or thereabouts. So this is what the crop factor does. It makes lenses, vintage lenses that is, behave differently. Let's explain a little more about that. So the lens projects from its rear, it projects an image, and that is circular shaped, so we call it the image circle. Why is it circular? Well, it's because the lens is circular, and we call that the image circle. Now that's the right size for a full frame sensor. A full frame sensor is just covered by that image circle, so we get the whole of the image. On an APS-C sensor, the image circle is too big for the sensor, so some of the image circle splashes outside the confines of the sensor, and the sensor sees a reduced part, a more central part of that image circle. So that means that the sides and the corners of the image circle are lost. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing as such. I've made many images this way. I've shot a lot of vintage lenses on small sensor cameras, APS-C and micro four thirds. But the sides and the corners are lost on those smaller sensors, so vintage lenses behave just a little differently. They don't behave quite like they did, or they do, on 35mm film cameras. And on a full frame camera, well, they do behave just as they're on a 35mm film camera. They behave in the way that they were intended to. Now, most of the faults and quirks of vintage lenses do appear in the corners and the sides of the shot. So when we shoot on smaller sensors, we are losing a little character. We are losing a little bit of the reason that we shoot these lenses in the first place. At least that is in theory. In practice, the effect is not particularly noticeable. I've made lots of vintage lens shots with smaller sensor cameras, and guess what? I just don't notice the fact that I'm losing a little bit of the image. We're still shooting a vintage lens and the character still comes through. So it might matter more in theory than it does actually in practice. So the third practical difference that emerges when you're shooting vintage lenses on smaller sensor cameras, the third actual day-to-day difference, is that wide vintage lenses, if you like to shoot wide vintage lenses, say a 28 or a 24mm, they stay wide. Now, because of the crop factor, we know that focal length increases. So if you get a 28mm lens and you put it on your Micro Four Thirds camera, that 28mm lens becomes, what's twice 28? 56mm. It behaves as though it has a 56mm focal length. So it's very difficult, especially if you're shooting Micro Four Thirds. It's really difficult to shoot wide vintage lenses because the crop factor means that they end up quite a bit longer than they should be, than they were actually intended to be when they're shot on 35mm cameras or indeed on full frame sensors. So that is tricky. If you like to shoot wide vintage lenses and you're shooting Micro Four Thirds, that's tricky. You're not going to find many wide lenses. If you wanted to find the equivalent of a 28mm lens to put on your Micro Four Thirds camera, you would need to find a 14mm vintage lens, and that's very, very, very wide indeed. There were only, I can't think offhand of a vintage lens that has a 14mm focal length. There will be some, but I know that they will also be very, very expensive. So if you want to shoot wides, vintage wides that is, don't shoot Micro Four Thirds. Right, let's sum up the pros and cons of shooting a full frame camera with vintage lenses. Firstly, better light gathering means you get cleaner images. Images are reduced in noise when you compare them to those from smaller sensor cameras at the same ISO settings. No way around it. Full frame images are cleaner because they require less electrical boost to the sensor. Vintage lenses shoot as they were made to do. There's no crop factor. Everything is the same. Focal lengths stay the same. Minimum focus distances stay the same. Everything's the same. It's easy to shoot wide vintage lenses on full frame cameras. Not so easy on Micro Four Thirds, as we've just noted. There are more pixels on a full frame sensor, so you can actually fit more pixels on there physically, therefore more resolution is possible. And I've also written here that it's cooler and it gives you more boasting points, which in fairness it probably does. So if you're into that, that's a plus point as well. Cons: the cameras are usually bigger and heavier. Not always. The original Sony A7 is a really small camera, pretty much as small as a Micro Four Thirds camera. But they are usually bigger and heavier, and that certainly applies to more recent cameras too. They're usually more expensive as well. Full frame cameras are expensive, and if you buy the latest top model, you're going to find yourself paying several thousands of pounds. These things are not cheap, and you can get an equivalent camera with a smaller sensor much more cheaply. Full frame sensors tend to be power hungry. The original A7 batteries, gosh, they'd last, what, an hour and a half if you were continuously shooting them. They really weren't good at all. However, battery capacity, battery life has got a lot better, and so that may not apply too much anymore. Modern lenses, if you shoot modern lenses on a full frame camera, those are bigger and heavier as well, and more expensive too. And oh, there goes a nice V-twin. I do like the sound of a V-engine. Finally, a full frame sensor doesn't make nicer images as such. Usually we can't tell when we look at an image, we just can't tell what sensor size made that image. I would defy anyone to pick out consistently which sensor size made which image. So in the end, what's good about full frame? Well, maybe three things. A, it gives less noise at higher ISO settings because of better light gathering abilities. B, there's no crop factor when you're shooting vintage lenses, so vintage lenses behave as they did on film. And C, nothing else. Do you need one? Well, if you want to shoot vintage lenses and use the full image circle, yes you do. Although APS-C and Micro Four Thirds lenses work very nicely with vintage lenses as well. If you do a lot of low light work and you want to maximize your ability to work in that low light, yes you do, you need a full frame sensor camera. But if you just want to shoot vintage lenses and make some nice, interesting and quirky images, and if you don't shoot too often in low light, no, you probably don't need a full frame sensor camera. Do you want one? Well, that's an entirely different matter, and only you can decide that. So there we are, that's my rundown of the abilities and non-abilities of full frame APS-C and Micro Four Thirds sensor sizes. I do hope it's been of some use, and I do hope it's helped out if you're making a difficult choice in buying a camera just at the moment. But as for me, that's probably about it for now. Many thanks for watching, and if you've watched this far and this long, a particular thanks to you. Many thanks go to subscribers for your support. I really do appreciate everybody that subscribes, and if you've enjoyed this episode, if it's been of some use, maybe you could consider subscribing as well. In fact, don't just consider it, please do it. That would be fantastic, and I'd really appreciate it. If you think this channel's not doing too bad a job of keeping this whole gear alive, lenses and cameras, and generally giving some sound advice on mirrorless camera shooting, you might want to become a patron. You can do that over at www.patreon.com/Zenography, and you can do it for as little as $1 per month. Many thanks, of course, go to existing patrons for all your support. I really do very sincerely appreciate that support, and I really couldn't make this, operate this channel in the way I do without that support. So many thanks for that. Many thanks to everybody who's watched, tuned in, given thanks, given super thanks, left a comment, or engaged with the channel in any way. I really do appreciate it all. And if you're not doing anything too difficult, irksome, bothersome, irritating or awful, next week is around this time, please do tune in and join me for a spot more Zenography. Cheerio all.